norm. Okay, on to the show, Season 2, Episode 44. Enjoy. My guest today is Professor David Pyne, a sports physiologist with 30 years practical and research experience across a range of individual and team sports, such as basketball, rugby union, rugby league, Australian football, cricket, and swimming at the Australian Institute of Sport. He has attended 4 Olympic Games and published over 200 peer-reviewed papers in exercise and sports science journals. Professor Pyne's work has focused on both practical interventions for enhancing sports performance and physiological mechanisms that explain variations in performance, health, and fitness. Prof, really appreciate you taking the time today.
Well, thanks for having me, Mark. I look forward to the conversation.
Terrific. Well, I look forward to diving into this topic today of exercise and immunity. But perhaps you could start the conversation by telling listeners a little bit more about your background and how you actually got started in research and sport.
Sure, Mark. As you said, I've probably had almost 2 lives going at once. So one is really being on the ground with sports in my role as a sports scientist, a frontline sports science or practitioner across a range of sports. So, as a sports enthusiast, it's great to get in and work, on the ground, on the court, on the pool deck with coaches and athletes. And so that's been a really rich and rewarding experience for me. So I guess it brings you up close to the action, but then I can apply my trade as the other frontline practitioners in working with the coaches and athletes, and then obviously dealing with all the challenges that are faced, I guess, in the real world. So in terms of preparing athletes during training and then all of the game preparations and recovery, and appreciating that sport really is sort of multifaceted. So there's a lot of work to do, and it's important work, obviously, with the athletes and the coaches devoting themselves, and we have to step up to the plate to be part of that show, if you like. And then, as you mentioned, I've had a long background really as a scientist, a research scientist doing applied research, trying to address some of those real-world issues, problems, the questions that arise from athletes and coaches. So I've done that in the laboratory. Some of that work's actually been in the field as well, and more recently now based, in university, and trying to work really in that way with the coaches and athletes staying connected, but then also working with a broad range of other professionals in industry and in the university sector, and also internationally. I mean, sport is global these days, so you've got to reach out far and wide to work with the best people.
Yeah, absolutely. And, if we kick things off here, and maybe we can get listeners on the same page by doing a quick Immunology 101. So perhaps you could define a few things, innate versus adaptive immunity, systemic versus local, etc.
Sure. And it's really about athlete health, I guess, is the topic of our discussion today, Mark.
For sure.
So health is, I guess, at a global level, that's, all our individual responsibility. So that's a big part of our education, and I'm sure we'll draw on some of that in the coming minutes. So that's sort of self-management and upskilling and educating athletes so they take that responsibility, which is the key at the end, and then also working with a range of sports science professionals, and particularly the primary care physician, your general practitioner or your sports medicine practitioner, who does have that primary responsibility and the expertise and the authority to look after the health and well-being of athletes. And then there's people like me who come in with interest as an exercise immunologist who works with the doctor, the athlete, and other providers like the sports nutritionists and dietitians. So it's all about health, and obviously the body's immune system is there to provide what we call the host defence against illness and infection, but also in terms of tissue healing and inflammation, which is a big part of sports. Every athlete knows, that injury is really a key consideration. So the body's immune system has evolved to ward off infection and deal with tissue repair, certainly in the sports setting. And, in simple terms, the immune system is comprised of 3 elements. So one is what we call the physical barriers, which is the skin. Obviously, that protects all the internal organs and the body. Then there's things like the mucus that lines the mouth, nose, nostril, respiratory system, even down to the gastrointestinal system, which contains all sorts of cells and antibodies. So those sort of physical barriers and the mucus. And then we come down to the immune cells, which are the white blood cells that circulate in the blood and in the tissues that actually fight infection. And then we have the antibodies or the proteins produced by the cells that provide the so-called specific immunity. So from top down, Mark, I think of it in that way. So there's the physical barriers, there's, I guess, the immune cells, the white blood cells, and then the antibodies. So those three elements combine. You mentioned about the innate versus the acquired immunity.
Yep.
So if we look at some of those immune cells, so some of those have this, what we call innate immunity. So they're ones that do have this antibacterial, antiviral activity. And one of the most common white blood cells is the neutrophil. So that undertakes phagocytosis. So, some technical terms there. But we also have the lymphocytes, which then form the antibodies. So we've got a range of these so-called white blood cells. So some of those have this innate function to attack viruses and bacteria, but the adaptive elements, so some of these antibodies, they'll target specific antigens. So if you pick up some sort of foreign bug that comes into the system, then the body will produce these cells and antibodies that target specifically. So it's often a bit of a battle that goes on between these so-called pathogenic agents, so viruses and bacteria, and then the body's immune system producing these antibodies. So normally that's in balance, but occasionally gets out of balance, and that could be dealt with obviously by pharmaceutical intervention or maybe nutritional intervention are probably the two key things there. The second question there, Mark, was the systemic versus local.
Yep.
So the system, I guess, is really, you can think about that in simple terms as the blood that circulates the body. So obviously at rest, we're pumping around a few litres per minute, and during exercise, so that can go up tenfold. So the immune system can ramp up pretty quickly in terms of this sort of systemic effects, but local, the easy way to think about that is really out in the periphery. So that where you might have, a localized infection, so it might be fungus of the feet, so tinea, or it could be a muscle strain in terms of athletes. And so then the body's got to pump the blood to get the white blood cells and the antibodies out to those sort of more peripheral areas, so the so-called local immunity. And then the final element is, what regulates all this, and this is this term cytokine, which are these protein messenger molecules. So the immune system normally lies fairly quiet, doing its thing, and then obviously when infection comes or there's a muscle strain or a muscle tear or some sort of bruise or contusion, then it's upregulated. And part of that upregulation is the cytokine messenger molecules. But once that's done its job, then the immune system needs to be downregulated, and then you get the cytokines also come in. So they're like the switch, if you like, to keep the immune system under control.
Perfect. And you mentioned the immune system and obviously inflammation, one of its major effectors, and of course, both regulated by things like exercise and nutrition. So maybe we can start here with exercise first. And could you perhaps outline for folks how, acute bouts of moderate exercise, how they impact immunity compared to more prolonged and intense bouts of exercise with more, elite type athletes?
Sure. This has been studied quite extensively. Certainly in the last probably 2 to 3 decades, there's the interest and the ability to study these things has increased with technology and medical breakthroughs, and then translating into sports medicine and sports science. That's been part of my work and many others around the world. So, the question is, how does the different forms of exercise impact? And as you said, the moderate exercise, which is the things that we promote, and in this day and age, it's all about being active and healthy.
For sure, getting more
and there's
movement.
been work done, so something for all of us, whether an elite athlete or just a recreational, someone just going around their everyday life. So being active is important, and that sort of low-level moderate exercise is beneficial in all sorts of ways for health, but one of the ways is it's been shown to actually enhance immune function. So those white blood cells and those protein responses can actually be increased or enhanced. So if you undertake exercise, and it's pretty moderate, as the standard sort of recommendations, 30 to 40 minutes, 3 or 4 times a week at a moderate intensity. So this is just your active walking or playing low-level sports or going to the gym and doing a workout.
Yep.
So moderate exercise is beneficial. But at the other end of the spectrum, really intense exercise that perhaps more is in the line of sports and elite athletes and a lot of recreational enthusiasts too who really push pretty hard. So
Definitely.
very intense exercise or very prolonged exercise, eventually that may be a little bit immunosuppressive. So you might get this little down regulation. So they talk about this post-exercise recovery period. So if you do moderate exercise, the immune system is actually upregulated for a few hours. And conversely, if you go out and really do a big session or have a really intense competition, sport or a match, then once you're really fatigued and exhausted, the immune system actually goes down for a little while. So they talk about this window of recovery, and that becomes then the target zone for the recovery interventions and also post-training nutrition.
That's terrific, David. And how do things for the athlete in terms of training, if training volume, frequency, intensity, even things like load sequencing, if an athlete is potentially at a higher risk or feeling run down, what are some things that they could do on those fronts to help mitigate that potential risk?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So I guess it's the extension of this sort of understanding that, potentially moderate exercise is good. But there are some risks, and I guess those risks for elite athletes can be moderated, if they're prepared and they're adapted and tolerate exercise. So it's obviously, and again, every athlete and coach would know that if you overdo it too soon, then that'll cause problems either by injury, a strain, fatigue, or potentially this sort of increased risk of illness.
Yep.
But over a period of weeks to months, as fitness increases, then the body's ability to handle all this sort of up and down motion of the immune system improves as well. So it's no surprise. It's just about doing, a balanced, progressive training, and this whole discussion around periodization in terms of the planning out week in, week out, is important. So you don't overdo it. And obviously through trial and error and people's expertise, they quickly know how to manage that. Well, most people. Not everyone. Some people, do the wrong thing. So I guess in terms of that level, Mark, so about your planning of preparing for competitions or a season, so you need to factor that in. So this sort of balanced training or periodised training. And you mentioned about, I guess, individual sessions and just prescription of exercise, so intensity and duration. So that's important, when you're planning the training weeks, but down to individual sessions. And so the conventional wisdom there is, you don't want too many high-intensity sessions in a row. So often, it might be 2 or 3 or 4, sessions where, it's a bit higher in load, so intensity and volume, but you're intermixing that with, lighter sessions or maybe some skill sessions or some shooting round sessions in basketball. So
Yep.
You're thinking about the effect of each session and then tallying that up. And so then you're looking at, week by week, how the load increases, and then how you actually vary that load as a coach and an athlete.
Yeah, that's terrific. I mean, obviously, nutrition, sleep, managing stress, whether from mental, emotional, even as well as training stress, so key in all these areas. And for sports scientists like yourself or practitioners, how do you measure immune system function in a meaningful way in athletes?
Yeah, it's a question I get asked a lot, and I guess my colleagues as well. So I think everyone understands, okay, health is important because we do want to stay healthy. We don't want to be distracted or inconvenienced by illness or injury or fatigue or poor performance. So everyone's invested in trying to find better ways to manage themselves. So as you said, Mark, it is a combination of factors, and that's where it's really, I guess, coming down to looking at the individual circumstances. When a team environment, everyone's basically on the same preparation or competition schedule.
Mm-hmm.
But even within that environment, athletes learn, and I guess that's the experience of athletes as they mature. They know how to manage themselves and manage the load. So it is a little bit of a checklist, as you said, so around that lifestyle management. So one is, I guess, their training and their exercise loads that we've been discussing. And then the other sort of main checklist, I guess, for people to run through, and this is the sort of conversation if I have a coach come to me or an athlete saying, look, having a few issues, I'm feeling a bit flat, or, I keep getting, colds and flus and so on. And then I just go through in my mind a little mental checklist around their lifestyle. So as you said, so it's their exercise and training loads, their recovery, both in terms of, exercise modalities and things that they can do at home, and sleep. And as you said, nutrition is a big one, which I'm sure we're going to come to in a minute, and managing stress levels, because no doubt that's a big driver anxiety, and again, we can all relate to that in our everyday life, with our lifestyle stress, job stress, home stress, relationship stress. So that's a big one. And so with athletes, you say, okay, how's your training? Okay, have you got anything else going on at home, at school, or in your work? You ask questions about their sleep. So, and everyone would sort of nod, okay, yeah, but you just need to go through those and explore a little bit and just see if there's anything that's a bit out of balance.
That's terrific. And, in terms of certain biomarkers as well, David, things like secretory IgA, how is that potentially useful in being able to evaluate, a stress load on an athlete or potentially how at risk they are for infection?
Well, not very, actually. So that's the question. People come in and say, look, let's just review your lifestyle arrangements. And then, as you said, okay, and what other tests? Can I get a blood test? Can I do some other test with the doc or lab tests? And you mentioned about saliva. And again, I've done a lot of work over the years, as have other groups around the world, on saliva, because saliva contains some of these proteins, the salivary IgA or immunoglobulin A. So it's a bit of a contentious point, actually, and there was a recent commentary just published earlier this year, which was really, I guess, critical of this sort of overemphasis on biomarkers. So it's a bit of an academic debate. So I would say, and having a foot in both camps, that you probably want to put the lifestyle factors first, and then you would work with your healthcare practitioner, so your sports dietitian or your GP or your sports doc, and saying, okay, I'm having some issues, and they would go through this sort of, okay, what's your history? What are you doing? Tell us about how you're training and recovering. And then they're, in probably a minority of cases, they might then organise, okay, we might get some blood work up, or we might do some other fancy test around a saliva test or viral tests. So the yields, as we scientists and medical people would say, what's the yield or the utility or the usefulness of the test?
For sure.
So they only have a limited value, and so I always defer back to, let's review the big picture, which certainly engages the individual. So I think they can certainly relate to that. If it's some fancy blood test, they might know, oh, can I get a blood test? But, often they don't have as much value as looking at their other lifestyle factors.
That's a great insight, especially in this day and age when we're always trying to find biomarkers to identify and flag all these things. And it's such a complex system, as you explained there. It's just, you need to be taking all these other things into account. You need to be communicating with the athlete. So that's terrific. And, if we dovetail now into this idea of how diet and nutrition impacts the immune system, and of course the genesis of this new term, Immuno-Nutrition. So perhaps you can walk listeners through some of your research in terms of, maybe we start with probiotics and how probiotics can influence potentially the immune system, and what the research tells us about probiotics in athletes.
Yeah, that's, again, a pretty topical area. So all of us, have probably been exposed to these messages, and obviously in terms of healthy eating and all the dietary supplements that we see on TV, and certainly in sporting circles, athletes, are interested in, how do they improve themselves through their eating and their nutrition. So certainly something that's quite topical. And again, as you would know, Mark, with your background, that a lot of information and learnings of athletes comes from what they hear and see. So these things are out there. I mean, the supplement use is pretty high in sports, and not only in, recognised sports, but also even in high schools. And they've done surveys, a lot of high school athletes, taking supplements. So certainly something that's out there. And probiotics is certainly one of the topical ones. They've been around for a few years. And in some ways, perhaps a bit of a hot topic as well. And like a lot of things, we're still learning our way through. So as a frontline researcher, I get a lot of practitioner, a lot of questions around probiotics, and it's been one of my areas. So I get inquiries from coaches, athletes, dietitians, other researchers and medical practitioners, and share some of my knowledge. But often there's more questions than answers. This is often the way.
For sure.
So there's a small body of research coming through. So the challenge for me is trying to match, what we learn on the ground with what the research is telling us, and then our sort of professional expertise. So the probiotics are these microorganisms, and it gets back to this whole gut and gut health, which again is pretty topical, and the gut microbiome, which is that collection of bacteria that lives in your gut. which is part of the body's digestion system. So, your average adult weighing, and I'm in metric units here, say 75 kilos, would have around about 750 grams to a kilogram of gut bacteria. So billions of bacteria, and they're there for digestion. So they're part of the natural processes of the human body and the digestive processes to break down the food. Of that 1 kilo of bacteria, there's about 500 different species. And some of those are really what we call probably the good bacteria. And some of these are the bad bacteria. And these are in balance. So, as you go along your daily activities, these things, just do their work and part of, digestion. But obviously things get out of sync. So sometimes more of the good bacteria, they're exerting their effects, and that's then healthy eating and good digestion. But in other occasions where the balance is tilted and the so-called bad bacteria take over. So probiotic supplements is really about adding a bit more of the good bacteria in. And so they're species that, again, people are probably familiar with the names, like lactobacillus or lactobacillus acidophilus.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the other main species is this bifidobacterium. So the ones that are advertised by the probiotic manufacturers and you see on TV, or if you go into your health nutrition store and you'll see, probably a few rows of shelves of probiotics. And if you looked on the side and read the label, a lot of them would have lactobacillus or bifidobacteria and variations of those. So there's been about 15 different species that have been studied of the 500. So there's still a lot that we don't know about the gut microbiome, but that's what the probiotics are. So they're so-called good bacteria that we add to the diet to supplement the other elements of the diet. And again, Mark, you would know about healthy eating. There's all sorts of good points there around the macronutrients, the carbohydrates, fats, proteins, fruits, vegetables, and so on. So probiotics are certainly in the mix there in the context of a good diet.
100%. And, in terms of that supplementation for athletes, is there something around, the frequency or the duration of infection that can be benefited by taking probiotics, whether it's prophylactically beforehand or whilst someone's having a bout of cold or flu?
There are small benefits. So, another takeaway message today, Mark, would be small variable benefits. And again, you put probiotics out and people say, I think they're good, think they work. And the research is supportive of that. So the message that I've written about is there's small variable benefits, which means that some people will get a small benefit. Some people might even get a moderate or large benefit. So they're having issues either with gut health or the immune system is a bit run down. Then they may actually get moderate or even a large benefit, probably less frequently. But in some other people, there's probably not that much benefit at all. So really a trivial benefit. The side effects or harmful effects are pretty rare. So, and I guess this is where you consult your healthcare practitioner, your dietitian or your doctor for taking any supplement. So probiotics are pretty safe if they're bought, obviously in the right place and from a reputable manufacturer. And the benefits there originally have been around gut health. So athletes that have issues around a leaky gut is the term. So that might be stomach cramps, it might be gas, it might be loose stools, diarrhea, which can occur particularly in some endurance events.
Yep.
So you're out there running marathons, triathlons. It interacts with the hot weather, which again I think you might want to come to in a moment. So there's a range of factors that might predispose athletes to gut problems and a range of gut symptoms. So probiotics in some individuals are certainly part of, a package of measures to try and relieve those symptoms and minimise the risk. The other area of benefit, which is probably more recent information, is in the respiratory system. And again, some of the work that I've done here in Australia and with some other colleagues showing benefits not only to the gut, but more generalised health benefits mediated by the immune system that might actually manifest in terms of improved respiratory health. And that's athletes, they get a lot of colds, or some athletes get a lot of colds and respiratory problems. And now it looks like, perhaps taking probiotics and a range of other dietary practices and potentially other supplements and medications might also improve respiratory health and lead to a decreased risk of a common cold or a flu coming in. So there's a range of health benefits, primarily the gut, but potentially other areas. And the most recent research mark is around this gut-brain
Connection,
axis, which is really still at the experimental stage and quite exciting. So in terms of things like mood, but also cognitive processing and maybe decision making. So in our athletes, right at the end of a really exhaustive event or a game, when you're coming down to the wire and trying to make smart decisions, so you don't want turnovers, in the last minute of a basketball game, for example. So there's intriguing work going on. A lot of that comes from the medical field, and the sports people are starting to look at that. So probiotics, small variable benefits, mainly for the gut, possibly for other systems. But we're looking for other benefits down the track as well.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff. I had Miguel Mateus from London, from the UK, on talking about that gut-brain connection. So there's definitely some potential there, which just seems exciting. And as you mentioned, obviously the bacteria in the gut is so crucial. And of course, as a food-first approach, having enough fiber in your diet, having prebiotics in your diet, eating a diet rich in polyphenols is really supportive of a good gut. So if we circle back to food and how food impacts the immune system, I know the role of carbohydrates have a key role in immunity. Could you walk listeners through how that can impact the immune system, especially with athletes who are really kind of pushing that red line in terms of training intensely?
Well, that's the key that you've touched on, and I mentioned a bit earlier. So it's a top-down approach. So starting with the basic food groups, the so-called macronutrients. And you mentioned there carbohydrate, and there's quite a bit of work around the benefits of carbohydrate. And we know in sports, obviously carbohydrate is a pretty important fuel source for all sorts of different sports, but particularly in that endurance area. And then proteins have their role as well around tissue repair, and obviously in some sports looking at particularly increasing muscle mass, so some of those power sports and in the contact sports. And obviously fats have their role as well as a fuel source. And again, I'm sure we recognise that a lot of these things are discussed pretty vigorously in sports and in sports nutrition and in research circles. So, that's a big discussion for another day, but I think take it as read that all of those have a role to play, and certainly carbohydrate in terms of immune function, because it provides a fuel source, so broken into glucose, and glucose is used by these white blood cells, but also indirectly through things like cortisol, so this hormonal system. And cortisol, amongst many other hormones, exerts all sorts of roles, influences on body cells and processes. So carbohydrates are important. And then you mentioned about polyphenols, so more now about fruits and vegetables for fiber content for having a good healthy gut. So that's important. And then looking at these polyphenols, which come from a lot of the fruits, fruit juices and so on. There's been a fair bit of work there done there. And one of my colleagues in the US, David Neiman, who's been one of the pioneers in this whole sports nutrition, immuno-nutrition area,
for sure,
has done a lot of work. And I think they have small variable benefits as well. So there's no panacea here, and it's really looking at a diet that really ticks most of the boxes, to use that analogy, and that I guess it's tried and tested so people are comfortable. And we work a lot with our athletes, so they know what works for them. So that's important. So it's trial and error as well as taking on the good advice.
Terrific. And if we continue down this road of macronutrients, obviously protein, really important for the immune system. We talked about carbohydrates. What about the role of omega-3 fats and the anti-inflammatory nature, and how that might impact immunity?
Yeah, and again, that's another topical one. Again, it just goes back to nutrition, really around omega-3 and polyunsaturated fats. So, we mentioned about fat as a fuel source, but these other different types of fats, so the lipids and then the fish oils, so your omega-3 do have important roles. And it's a bit the same, like I guess I take the middle road here, Mark. You will find some people that swear by these either through their own anecdotal reports, or some people have pushed these things through in a commercial sense. So
Yeah.
again, these things aren't the answer, but fish oils are important. Having fish in the diet. So coming back to the just food groups, so we can talk about the red meats and the white meats for protein sources. And obviously, again, you throw in the term like the heme iron in those red meats, but the white meats and fish is a good source of protein, but because it also has a range of these other products, the omega-3, and that can be sourced through the food sources, but also supplements. And it's the same with the probiotics. So I guess the final point there, Mark, is so we talked a lot about supplements, but don't neglect the food sources of probiotics, which are mainly these dairy foods. So certain cheeses and yogurts, which again most people would know, and some of those milk dairy products, but also cultured foods. And there's increasing interest in a range of cultured foods, and really one real popular one now is kombucha. So fermented tea, which is certainly popular in certain places, here in Australia. So there's a range of other sources, and some of those are different foods. There's Asian style foods, so kimchi, which is Korean, the kombucha. So encourage people to look at their diet, and certainly in making sure their dairy products and their dairy sources, fish, as you mentioned, but also they could explore some of these and, ask again your healthcare practitioner. And there's a fair bit of information around on different sources of fermented foods, and it could be a complement of, fermented foods and potentially probiotic supplements if you wanted to go down that path.
Yeah, that's terrific. I mean, definitely having that well-rounded nutritional base of what the athlete's eating is so crucial to this whole story. And Prof, in your years of experience, are there certain supplements, whether it's athletes or the general population, that get a lot of maybe press or people tend to think of in terms of the immune system, but when you look at the evidence base, there's just not a lot of good support to actually be using such a product?
Yeah, there's a long list, isn't there? So I guess that's
sure.
what we would say the elephant in the room.
Yeah.
So as we've been discussing today, I think you start in the middle and look at this sort of fairly conventional approach. So it's this food first analogy that you mentioned, Mark. So certainly I'm big on that, and then work your way down the list. So certainly supplements have a role. There's no doubt about that. But then you've got to make sure you're taking the right ones. So which are the right ones? Well, I guess that's the minefield for people to navigate, and even for practitioners like yourself and myself. That's an ongoing education for us. And sometimes these things, are heavily promoted, and there's a lot of interest that precedes, I guess, the evidence base. So there's no easy answer to that. So I guess that's just asking the questions of, and that's probably, again, one of the take-home messages today. So within the context of your team, so your coach, your staff, each other, but certainly getting that healthcare practitioner advice would be critical, because all of us, have really got to follow that evidence base. But then, it's doing that individual basis, so I can't emphasise enough. Again, it goes back to the old trial and error in a way. So here's something that people recommend, but then you've got to use it in your setting. So, in your diet, in your training program, in your lifestyle. So get the advice, but then, systematically look at how you can best use those supplements would be my advice.
Yeah, terrific advice in terms of that individualized approach, being able to personalize that and really sitting down with the athlete, the team, whoever's in front of you, and figuring out the best way to get to that outcome of keeping all those athletes healthy and on the pitch, on the playing field, and training throughout the season. And if we circle back to something that you mentioned before that we were going to get to here, which is the environmental extremes, things like very hot, very cold. How do those things impact immune function?
In a minor way, and again, cut to the bottom line. So, it's where are the big effects? The big effects that we're talking about today are diet and probably training, and potentially these other lifestyle stresses, the psychological stress. So when that comes in, that can have a really powerful impact that can almost overwhelm the system. So, the everyday management is probably training and sleep and recovery and diet. And occasionally these big life events will come in, and probably the environmental stress is a bit like that. So it's probably, a secondary consideration for the most part. And again, that's something that should be fairly readily identifiable. So obviously there are extremes, so particularly in the heat. There's been a lot of work done, and certainly if the conditions are really oppressive, so it's hot and humid and people aren't prepared for it in terms of heat training and their cooling and their drinks, and then they get heat stress, and there are obviously every year people who succumb to that. But you do know the conditions are going to be pretty adverse, so you've got to be smart and sensible. Try and avoid training and competing in the middle part of the day. So there's no doubt that heat stress does have its risks, but they should be readily identifiable, and there's a lot of mitigation strategies that you can undertake. The other environmental ones probably that come into it are air pollution. So again, a lot of us live in big cities now, and the air quality can be pretty variable. So from reasonable to poor to very poor. So, but again, that's fairly readily identifiable, I think. So if you're living in a big city, you can get a sense of that, or you can find the information. So staying away from more heavily polluted, thinking of air, but also in water. For those athletes competing on or in water. So I think it's just being smart and alert about trying to minimise these risks, where they present. So we talk about heat, we talk about air and water pollution, and probably the other one would be altitude. So again, not for every athlete, but some of the winter sport athletes and some of the athletes who compete and train in high altitude, that can be pretty stressful if you're not prepared for it. But again, you will know that. I mean, you should know where you are or where you've got to train or compete at. So again, that's something that can be built into the preparation program.
That's terrific. And Prof, if we talk sort of marginal gains and some of the different recovery strategies, whether, again, it's athletes, even general population, people using saunas, people using ice baths, are there some potential benefits there on immune function with some of these recovery strategies?
I think so. Again, what we're talking about, Mark, is, well, what's the biggest factor is probably sleep. And there's a lot of work being done at the moment. So in terms of recovery practices, that pretty much is at the top of the list. And then you come to nutrition and training modification. So how you plan your training week and your program to have enough recovery around sort of just easy exercise, so shooting around or maybe an easy run. And then you come to things like all the recovery modalities, which are the saunas, the plunge pools, the contrast water, immersion, the massage. So those things, again, there's some evidence out there. So I think, there's gathering evidence on sleep. The nutrition, as we've been discussing today, Mark, is pretty important. Exercise itself is pretty important. You come down to some of those other recovery things, and the evidence there is perhaps a bit thinner, but I'm always pragmatic, and if people, again, like using these, and that's where the belief factor comes in. So we talk a lot about the placebo effect.
It's amazing how powerful it is, right?
Having a massage, it is. That's very powerful. So again, it's wrapped up in the psychology and belief. So like some athletes swear by massage, so they might get 1 or 2 massages a week. It makes them feel good, and there might be some actual physical benefits, hands-on body, but it's probably the psychological and the belief. And so that's what coaching is really. There's a lot of psychology that goes in coaching and a lot of belief factors. So that's the world that we live in. We all respond to that in whatever we do. So, and recovery's in there as well. If people think they're eating right and they've done a bit of homework and they know they respond well to certain diets, either pre-game or post-game, well, that's a pretty powerful factor. And I know talking with our dietitians here, well, let's get it right. Let's get the nutrition right. Let's rehearse it, and people get the confidence that, I feel pretty good doing this. So you're getting everything. You're getting the actual physiological, biological effect, and you're getting the belief effect and that confidence that, I've done this many times before and I normally feel pretty good. So I think it's wrapping all those things in. So good eating, good training, good recovery, and then the confidence that that that's the system that works for you as an athlete.
Fantastic, Prof. Great insights here, and I definitely want to respect your time. So before we wrap up, last couple questions for you. Over the course of your career, what have you seen? What are some of the biggest changes you've seen over the time when you started out to now, whether it's on the immunity, exercise and immunity front, the nutrition, sleep, all these things, and in your experiences, what are some of the biggest eye-openers of changes that have happened over that time span?
Well, I think as we were just discussing, it's the explosion of information. I mean, it's the digital world, internet age, social media. So the amount of information that's out there, although some of it obviously then is this sort of fairly anecdotal. So, that's certainly, even in our lifestyle last 5 to 10 years, it's just really changed a lot. So it's, a busy marketplace out there for athletes, and to be bombarded with all sorts of information. So how do they filter that? So I guess that's a big challenge now. And for me, it's still doing this background research to find answers. And then it's the real world experience of working with athletes and coaches and other practitioners to learn. So it's the combination of trial and error and people's hard-earned experience. And you complement that with the research, which often takes a bit of time and often that will lag. And it's bringing that information together, but then it's how is that information communicated. And so there's all sorts of ways of doing that, but the challenge is it's, against this background noise. So for me, it's still that journey about trying to learn and learn more and learn as we go from coaches and healthcare providers and fellow researchers, and then trying to make sense of that. But what are the messages? How do we package up the messages? And obviously it's trying to get clear, simple, evidence-based messages out, which I think are there. And so we're trying to promote, good eating, good lifestyle management, good training management. And obviously that's different things for different sports and different events and different people. So getting that sort of fairly conventional advice out, against the background noise. So that's the challenge that we're all in, but it's then just about communication and engagement and just how we move forward.
That's terrific. And, on that note of providing evidence-based answers, if obviously athletes listening in, recreational athletes, practitioners, for folks who are trying to prevent, cold and flu, to be able to train hard over the course of this winter season, what are some practical evidence-based tips that they can use to help prevent infections?
Well, a lot of things we have discussed. I guess the other one, Mark, that we probably haven't really touched on is hygiene. So in terms of illness, then really it's really about trying to prevent illness, and so this is transmission. And there's three main sources there that you can look at your hygiene. So one is airborne transmission. So this is what everybody knows. It's the coughing and sneezing, which do come with the winter season, so the flu season. And there's obviously an increase in the number of cases of common colds and influenza. So a lot of those are transmitted through coughing and sneezing. So again, that's for everyone to see. So it's about doing the right thing. If you are feeling a bit ill and you are sneezing and coughing, just do the right thing by people in your immediate vicinity. So teammates, people at home, people in the workplace. So be alert to coughing and sneezing, doing the right thing there. The second one probably is more this sort of food and waterborne transmission. So again, we've talked a lot today about healthy eating. So that's just making sure you've got good, healthy food practices so that food isn't contaminated, left out in the sun or left out of the refrigerator, and is being prepared, hygienically. And the same with water. So obviously clean water is important, and sharing of drink bottles, in the team sense. So that's important advice. And the third one, I guess, is more in the medical domain, is around bloodborne infection. Mm-hmm. So transmission through bloodborne, and again, this has been known for quite a few years now. So in terms of particularly contact sports, where there's cut or blood, and most sports now have pretty strict rules. So if someone gets cut and there's blood, normally there's a stoppage there, and they'll go to the blood bin or get cleaned up. So they're the three main areas that people need to be alert. So it's airborne through coughing and sneezing, food and water. So it's just doing the right thing, being hygienic there, and washing of hands is important. And then obviously in context of sports, it's just being alert to bloodborne. But people are pretty good on the bloodborne these days, but sometimes we get a bit complacent around hand hygiene.
That's terrific. Yeah, it's amazing how those fundamentals become so important. And I think anybody who has little kids under 5 who go to daycares and whatnot are definitely clued up on the hand washing and everything else, because it is amazing how quickly things go around. And last question for you here, Prof. I want to definitely respect your time here. So, in terms of the evolution of research on exercise and immunology, where will we be in the next sort of 5 or 10 years? Is it biomarkers? Is it on the nutrition, the supplemental front? Where's the next breakthrough, do you think, to come?
Yeah, it's a good question. I guess I'll answer that in two ways. So one is it'll always be the combination of this practical advice. So we've discussed today mainly around these practical strategies, diet, training, lifestyle, and trying to improve our understanding of those practices. And that's still coming through. There's still more of that applied work around practical strategies, but more on the medical front. So it's just now, right at the cutting edge of medical and sports medicine research is, in the lab now. So this is things like the gut microbiome, and we're still at our infancy of understanding, what is it about the microbiome? How do we measure it? How do we improve it through, diet or other means? So a lot of that is this benchtop work. So taking blood samples and analysing those in the lab. So looking at the gut microbiome, which you can actually analyse through the blood. It's pretty hard to actually do the tissue sections. Obviously, we can take specimens, and that's obviously like our gastroenterologists can sometimes take tissue sections. That's not something that we access a lot in sports medicine. And the other way there is obviously through stool analysis, which sounds a bit yucky, but again, that's one means. So we're learning a lot
Assess the
really
bacteria,
about gut
for
health.
sure.
And then the other one is the immune system and its regulation, which we touched on right at the start. But it's looking then, I guess, at the whole regulation of that through cytokines, so these protein messenger molecules, through the gut-brain axis and all the neurotransmitters that circulate in the body that have these powerful effects in the brain and then on our mental functioning. And then things like the whole genetic control, so the genome and the phenotype and obviously the epigenetics research, which is a big field in medicine, so all around disease and lifestyle diseases and cancers. So there's work now, exploratory work now being undertaken in there to understand at a genetic level, while some people have really good guts, some people have really good immune systems, maybe some people have really resilient bodies in terms of injuries and illness and fatigue. So all that work that's the 5, 10-year, 20-year time frame. So for me, we continue to learn as we go with trial and error and the practical side. But we're obviously working now to see what the latest breakthroughs, but they do take a while to come through into the system so that people can access that information.
Yeah, it's definitely fascinating stuff, Prof, and really appreciate you taking the time, and definitely want to, where can people stay connected with you and keep up with all of your phenomenal research?
Well, I'm accessible like everyone through obviously the internet, and obviously if you use my name in your search engine, and University of Canberra is my host organisation, but certainly in connection with any of these topics that we've discussed today. So search engine in the sports science space through immune system or probiotics, which has been part of our main discussion today. You'll find access to some of the work that I've done, and certainly happy to take any of those inquiries.
Fantastic.